Welcome, everyone, to another edition of What's Working. I'm Cam Marston, your host. Thanks for joining us. This on-again, off-again podcast is going to slowly resurrect itself after having taken a break for a while. I'm ready to get back into what's working, and today's show will be a great way to dive into it. Dan Sigmond is coming back. Dan was last with us when he was a member of the FBI. He was a special agent in the FBI. He has since retired, and with his retirement has been able to share some stories and things that I think we're going to find very interesting. Dan and I met for lunch a couple of weeks ago to talk about this show, and the stories that he shared over lunch, I said, we've got to get this story told on the air. So this week we'll have Dan Sigmond returning to What's Working, talking about financial crimes, his time in the Bureau, his read on things in the Bureau today. There have been a lot of changes, as you well know, and whatever Dan seems to find interesting about the cases that he was working and what he is working today under this new private sector cap. We'll be right back after this break with Dan Sigmond, retired FBI agent. Hi, I'm Cam Marston. Many business leaders like you are facing declining sales, high turnover, low morale, all because of poor communication. That's why I created the Generational Insights Communications Academy. The Academy trains your leaders to communicate effectively with anyone in any situation, helping you build the thriving company you deserve. Learn more and enroll today at cammarston.com/GICA. We're back. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. Sitting across from me is Dan Sigmond, as I said in the opening comments. He was a guest on the show previously, maybe over a year ago now, and it was one of the more popular shows we recorded. Dan sees the world through a different lens. It's a lens that most of us probably never glance through until something's gone wrong. Dan is the guy that many people went to when he was with the FBI to help fix what had gone wrong, as well as to prevent it from happening further. Dan, as always, like I said over a year ago, thank you for your time. Welcome back to What's Working.
Thanks, Cam.
Happy that you're here.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I really appreciate you having me. You know, I spent 35 years in the U.S. military and federal service, the Air Force, and then over 2 decades with the FBI, primarily focused on financial crime, fraud, and cyber-related investigations. And what I've learned over that time is that whenever it's an act that happens, whether it's a criminal organization or a business, risk shows up the same way. It hides some patterns that people don't really recognize.
Yeah, that pattern stuff I think is really interesting. But before we get into that, and I want to jump into what those patterns may be, you and I, when we reconnected about doing this show, you told me an interesting story that happened after our last show was recorded, that somebody heard that recording and there was a very interesting outcome. Tell us that story quickly.
Right. Yeah, it's a great story. And we had a few laughs over that, if you remember.
Yeah.
So, as you know, and your listeners that have heard me before know that I worked, a significant amount of financial criminal investigations in the FBI. And one of the type of criminals that we handle or crimes that we handle is business email compromise. So we were working it's called a BEC to keep it short. So we're working a BEC case and involved a title company in Alabama that had gotten scammed from their email being spoofed or intercepted, to where the wiring instructions for the title transaction were changed slightly, and they wound up wiring the money to a wrong bank account. And so by the time they realized it, they attempted to work through their banks unsuccessfully. Some of the money was frozen, but they can never get confirmation on other monetary transactions that occurred because I guess the wire was split into several different pieces. And so they contacted the FBI, and I was the case agent at the time, and I was the individual that they spoke with. And so the FBI, we went through a series of, steps to recover that money, including freezing the money along the way, obtaining seizure warrants, and of course, identifying who owns the accounts, whether the accounts were overseas or whether they were domestic. And it turned out we were lucky in this case that the accounts were actually domestic accounts. And the money had gone in from one account into another, and then broken into 2 different accounts under that same bank. And then from there, it funneled into roughly about 7 different banks.
Wow.
And that's a classic for a laundering transaction. You and I in our show, we've talked about money laundering before, and that's one of my expertise in tracing that kind of money. And so we quickly were able to identify those accounts. And of course, as it always is, there was all these different banks, different numbers, different names, and they all turned out to be fake names, but they were all connected, as it turned out, to one particular person. And when we identified that person, she was in her 60s. She lived in the United States. I think she was a retired teacher. And so it just didn't fit the bill, right? There's something off. And in my experience, I kind of already knew what this was, but I like to give things the benefit of the doubt, especially we deal in facts, not fiction in the Bureau. But, I had a hunch that she was either a romance scam or she was involved in some type of, we've seen employment scams. You and I have talked online and even offline, right, about various different types of scams that people fall victim to.
Yeah.
And they themselves don't realize that they're being played, and they become what's called a mule, if you remember that.
Right, mule.
And we have different types of mules, right? We have the ones that are completely complicit. We have the ones that are kind of in between, where they're in the gray area. And then we have the ones that are just the Bambi in the woods, where they're just completely clueless and being played. And so, typically what we see is, elderly people, those with dementia or incapacitated in some way, they fall victim to scams fairly easy. But someone in their 60s who's a retired teacher, they should kind of know better a little bit. So we started identifying all the transactions that she occurred. We did some search warrants on her accounts. We started tracing things, and then eventually I got comfortable enough to leave a voicemail with her, because she didn't answer her phone. When I guess it shows up, U.S. government's calling, and so maybe she thinks it's a scam, or she's scared to death, whatever it was. She did not answer her phone. And so I left a voicemail and basically identified myself. And I told her, look, I feel you may be a victim, or if you're not, you're definitely involved in some suspicious monetary transactions. We've already frozen your accounts, as you well know, because she would have known by that time, all that money was locked down. But there was some money that had, escaped, and we couldn't account for it. Some cash withdrawals and some other cashier's checks that were issued out of some of the bank accounts that she operated under these different fake names. And so that was it. I never heard from her again until about a week later. And that's when I get a call from her, and she tells me this story about how she didn't know who to believe, because she'd be getting calls from all these different people, and her, for lack of a better term, her handler, the person who was directing her to do these crimes,
right,
that because she was definitely a mule, he told her that I wasn't real. And I guess he told her about the voice. She told him about the voicemail, and he told her, no, I've got real FBI agents working for me. Here, you can talk to one or whatever.
Oh, really?
And so she quickly figured out that, hey, I think I'm being played here. And so she winds up Googling me. She told me all this. She winds up Googling me, and the first hit that she gets on the Google was our interview with What's Working with Cam Marston. I think it was a YouTube video, or we're on Spotify.
Yeah.
We're quite popular these days, you and I, Cam.
Yeah.
And so I guess not too many FBI agents doing interviews on Spotify, I guess, right?
Right.
Or on NPR. But so she Googles it, and she listens to our interview in its entirety. And she said she was so moved and brought to tears that she decided she wanted to cooperate fully, and she wanted to confess. And she gave me a full accounting of how this all started. Originally, it was a romance scam, and then eventually she kind of figured out it was fake. But she was so in debt with all the money that she invested that she was trying to recuperate some of it, and she felt somewhat guilty about that. But she wanted to cooperate fully, and so I ran it all by the U.S. Attorney's Office after her confession, and she the U.S. Attorney's Office decided not to charge her, and she did. She cooperated completely, and all that unaccounted money that we could not, even the cash transactions, cash is king, right? But cash is also gone. If it is very hard to recover cash, as
Sure.
you know, as anyone knows, it's just common sense. Well, she even told us what she did with the cash and how she used the cash. And so she was willing to refund the cash. And so she did all that graciously. And we would have never, ever, I've never had a case like that in my almost 21 years in the Bureau. I've never had like a subject of, well, hey, and there's also this cash that, that I did. So she's very, very honest, nice lady, and she winds up recovering all the money. So eventually we give, the money goes through a series of transactions in the government. And just like the government is, everybody knows is listening, the government is extremely efficient. And
that's right. That's right.
I mean, I have retired how many months ago, and I still haven't been paid my retirement yet.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
So the money still hadn't reached the victim yet, but I guess it started to trickle in about a month to maybe even 2 months later. It's kind of atrocious, the timeline for that. But anyway, there's just a lot of legal steps involved, and it's a lot of administrative red tape.
But the result is that our interview, which is somewhere, in amber out there on the internet, was the trigger that made her want to confess.
Absolutely, without a doubt. I mean, she even said that and made a point of that. She said that she listened to our interview, and I guess she had heard you before too. She knew who Cam Marston was.
Yeah, well.
And, because you do another, I guess, Keeping It Real with
That's
Cam
right.
on NPR. And so she had listened to that before, and she couldn't believe it. And she listened to our entire interview in entirety. And she said that she believed, again, that she was a mule, which I told you, I figured that out from day one once I started, identifying her. But she actually said, yeah, I'm a mule. And I said, yeah, I believe you are. And then the funny story was it went even further dealing with her. Like, she was so moved by her interview that, remember we talked offline about the additional money. So for for listeners out there, the victim calls me and he's like, hey, thanks again for recovering his money. But hey, just so you know, like, I'm missing, it was a little over $5,000 to $7,000, something like that. And I remember, like, when we originally, the numbers kept changing. Like, the title company had come through and said, well, it was originally like $5,000 off or $7,000 off. And so I remember that number being quite off. And so, of course, I believed him. And so I went back and looked at the auditing, and I realized, yeah, you're right. There's some money missing. And it came down to a check that she checked or cashed at a check cashing store. And so I called her back and I asked her, I said, hey, what did you do with that money that you got from the check cashing store? And she's like, well, I was wondering if you were going to ask about that.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I am asking about that. Well, where's the money? And she's like, well, I just figured if the government wanted that money, they would have asked me, but you never asked me for it. So I stuck that in a savings account. Do you want the money? And I said, well, yes, I do want the money. So she wound up writing a personal check.
No kidding.
A personal check to the U.S. Marshal Service, because everything gets written to the Marshal Service, and mailed it to FedEx to our office and with my instructions. So yeah, you can't make this up. I mean,
no, it's nice to find an honest crook from time to time.
Yeah, really nice.
That says, hey, I've been caught. So tell me that you retired from the FBI. I think it was back in January. Is that right?
Yeah, I retired at the end of January, the last day of the pay period there, January 24th.
And what are you up to now? Knowing you, the little that I do, you're too active, you're too smart, you're too busy to just be retired. What are you up to?
Well, I've been doing a lot of yoga. I mean, waking up at 11 o'clock in the morning. No, I'm just kidding. I'm still getting up super early. And been going to a lot of yoga classes. But besides that, I launched a company called Special Agent Advisory Group. And the idea is simple behind the company. I bring an investigative mindset into the private sector.
Yeah. It's something that you've mastered or learned or honed at the FBI, and now you're offering those services to the private sector. What type of companies could use your help?
Well, I work with businesses, executives, and legal teams to identify risk, to analyze operations, and uncover hidden vulnerabilities across financial systems like compliance structures and organizational processes. Because, most organizations don't have an internal investigative function, but they absolutely have investigative level problems. And that's really the gap I fill. I didn't leave, like you said, I didn't leave the FBI to slow down. I left it to bring that mindset into places I think need it, but don't have it.
You told me at one point, I feel like when we were having lunch, that a minority, no, I got that backwards. the majority of thefts, financial thefts, are never reported. People just kind of give up on them or are embarrassed about it. Is that something you're hoping changes? Is that something you can influence?
Yeah, I really do. I think that, the more podcasts we do like this, the more education. I think education, believe it or not, is key. I mean, and that's not just, a mantra or just a saying. The interesting thing is that if, like, for example, imagine if the elderly population had the investigative mindset of an FBI agent, there would virtually be no elder fraud on the planet.
Yeah.
And the problem is that I don't know what the figures are now, but when I left the Bureau, about between 40 to 50% of the crimes were reported. And it was a fraction of that amount was reported into a system called IC3, which is Internet Crime and Complaint Center. And that is the kind of, that's the golden ticket for tracking those types of crimes, especially when you're pulling down those figures as an investigator, whether you're a local, state, or federal law enforcement officer. And so if you're only getting about a 40% hit or less on what the real picture is out there, and yet you're looking at numbers that indicate that the business email compromise, for example, and cryptocurrency fraud is a $7 billion industry.
Wow.
Where's the other 60%? And imagine what kind of numbers you're dealing with then.
Yeah. And I suspect the reason that people don't report it is embarrassment. I'll never get this back. I'm not sure what happened. If I admit that I don't know what happened, it makes me look weak. It makes my company look weak. There's got to be regular reasons people don't mention what happened to them.
Yeah, I think embarrassment's probably low on the list. Maybe in the old days it was higher on the list, but in the old days we didn't have scams like we have today. I think it's not really so much as embarrassment as what you said in your latter part of your comment there. I believe that a lot of companies are, one, worried about what their shareholders will think.
Yeah.
Or two, worried that, it would generate some type of scrutiny, especially from the FBI. But that's just typically not the case. I mean, we deal in just, a factual realm, and we're investigators, and our ultimate interests are not only in recovering the money, but also holding those accountable. And, I no longer do that for a living, but I hope through my company that at least I can identify those risks or mitigate those in ways that are as effective as if you had a team of FBI agents at your fingertips.
What are the most common types of fraud? Have they changed since you and I were together?
Well, no, not really. I mean, they just got more complicated, and by complicated, it's all about speed, right? And you can do trading nowadays in milliseconds, right? And so just imagine the financial sector, what it's capable of doing, and therefore, if the criminals are operating in that realm, how fast they're able to operate. But it's still the top four are still business email compromises, payment diversion fraud, romance or trust-based scams.
Yeah, we talked about that over lunch.
And now some of the new stuff is, artificial intelligence enhanced impersonations.
How does that come through? What is an AI enhanced impersonation?
AI is a wonderful tool. I mean, it's, just look at ChatGPT and other types of Gemini and all these other programs. So the criminals are able to use those as well to basically impersonate, not only high figure, like in the old days, it was like, they're impersonating the president and stuff like that. And it was almost as kind of a joke, but now they're able to, produce fairly stout emails, even mailed correspondence, voice activated recordings, interface live with modified voices of different people that sound just like me, for example. Now that I'm on the radio, technically some criminal can say, hey, I'm going to, pose as me and can download a sample of my voice, and AI will generate any conversation he types in the keyboard.
Yeah.
And that's really unfortunate. Basically, look, as I've told you before, and we talked about in the last time we were together, fraud is not random, right? It's engineered, and it's engineered around human behavior.
Human behavior. And what you and I talked about a great deal when we were at lunch talking about this show is trust. fraud is, and to use your quote, people turn trust into money.
Mm-hmm.
And I think every one of these scams that we mentioned, the business email compromise, the payment diversion, the romance stuff, is all using trust to swindle somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you hate to go through life not trusting everybody. I mean, I know you need to play defense and have your defenses up. What's the solution?
Look, the solution is to stay vigilant. The biggest misconception that people make, and again, what else we've talked about, you and I together, is how there's always an assumption that, oh, this is so sophisticated, I can never fall for something that sophisticated. I mean, because these criminals are masterminds. And what have you and I talked about that misconception?
Yeah, they're just diligent. They're throwing 1,000 lines in the water.
Right. And it's just nothing to where it's that sophisticated. It all comes down to exploiting the trust.
Right.
And again, the biggest misconception people have is that they think scams are getting more sophisticated. In reality, they're just getting more targeted. Okay. So the tactics are often simple. What's changed is the access to the data and the ability to personalize those attacks.
Yeah. So I'm familiar with it on a personal level. I had an experience just over a year ago in my family where somebody close to me was targeted this way, and it didn't go as it didn't. They could have made out with a lot more money than they did. Thankfully, they did not. Several of us said something's up here and advised the family member, and thankfully they stopped it. But that's on a personal level. Is this happening at a corporate level as well to the same degree? I suspect that it is. I mean, they're going to go where the biggest dollar amounts can be found, and it's more likely in the corporations than it is you or me individually.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the story that we opened up with is it's not a corporate level case per se, but it involved a law firm and a title company that do a lot of business, millions of dollars in the state of Alabama. And they fell victim to a loss of, luckily, only $300,000. And luckily, I was able to recover almost the entire amount.
Right.
But I've worked other cases where we haven't been so lucky. And then I've worked other cases where, it's as simple as a big corporation falling victim to the same type of scheme, whether it's a business email compromise or whether it's a social engineered attack. And we've talked about social engineering before. And, where their trust is manipulated. They believe that they're dealing with something legitimate or someone they recognize, and it's completely fraudulent and misrepresented. And the next thing you know, they're out. In this case, the one case I remember was they were out over $100,000, which wasn't, again, for a big company, that much money in the grand scheme of things of what they do in millions of dollars of business each year. But they also got lucky where that money was sitting in a foreign bank account. And because that somebody messed up the routing instructions, it just sat there for 6 months.
Wow.
And by the time they called me, I was almost certain the money was gone, but then we were able to recover it. And I'll tell you something, one of the things, and I know if there's other agents, federal law enforcement officers listening to this podcast, they're all going to agree with what I'm going to say, is one of the best things to do is to recover money for a victim, especially when they fall victim to these types of attacks. I mean, they are not only grateful, but it just makes you feel really like, wow, I've really made a difference in this life and everything. And
valued.
Now, I've also had those victims where they haven't been so gracious, and you recover almost. I had one victim where we recovered almost 99% of their money. And they were upset about the remaining 1%.
Really?
And it was them actually that they were at fault for, the mismanagement of the money. I mean, had they had any decent security level or even, quality assurance things in place, that would have never happened.
Yeah.
And again, when we talk about those things, that's that type of experience that I bring now to the private sector, right? I mean, I've testified in over 200 matters. I've, had this years and years of experience working these types of cases. And so I can see them all from different types of angles. And that's the type of credibility and experience that most consulting firms don't have, that I bring.
Yeah.
And that's why I started that company.
I think that's great. And I think there's obviously a great value for us. Give me an example of, now that you're out of the bureau, maybe you can talk more freely about these things, but some of the cases that you were involved with that I think the listeners will find interesting.
Well, I mean, one of the cases that's probably the more recent one that when I retired was Operation Jamaican Nights. I worked a case that was a large-scale publishers clearinghouse fraud targeting U.S. victims all across not only the United States, but also some victims in Canada and overseas. And it was orchestrated from individuals operating out of Jamaica. Jamaica was notorious. They used to be called, as a matter of fact, I don't know if it's the FBI that coined the phrase, but I mean, certainly when I joined the FBI over 20 years ago, there was a common classification of fraud called Jamaican lottery schemes. And so they have these call centers over there in Jamaica where they impersonate these lottery, companies. And one of them was Publishers Clearinghouse. And that was the one that they were impersonating at this time. Coincidentally, I think, you realize Publisher Clearinghouse has gone out of business.
I haven't seen those commercials.
So
I
don't know who they're impersonating now, but we've made a significant dent into the operations of the lottery schemes operating overseas, and it was a very, very good case. Most of the defendants, if not all of them, have already pled guilty and have even been sentenced. I think there's still a few sentencing out there, so we won't talk case specifics, so to speak. But what made it interesting wasn't just the money, it was the psychology of the crime. Again, going back to what I said earlier, these weren't like smash and grab crimes. These were long-term trust-building schemes, and the victims, we talk about social engineering. These victims were groomed. Most of them were elderly, and when we wound up identifying them, and we had the cooperation of several mail carriers and shipping carriers here in the U.S., obviously, because they have really good security departments, and so with their cooperation, they were also able to identify additional victims and even interview them when they ask them, hey, why are you shipping, cash, for example, or why are you shipping these types of conspicuous packages in the way that they were packaged? Because your Postal Service, FedEx, UPS, they all have these screening capabilities where when they run the packages through a particular program, it goes through a series of algorithms. They determine if, those packages fit, a certain demographic. If they see a lot of packages being mailed to a particular address, and that address is coming from all these different places all across the United States, then the AI, software that they use and the algorithms are able to figure out, hey, we need to send this package for secondary screening. And that's how a lot of these crimes were identified. And then, of course, they notify the FBI, and they're like, hey, or the Postal Inspection Service, and they're like, hey, we think we got something. Yeah.
So in other words, there are packages going to a destination that is atypical. Something strange is going on, and that's what the Postal Service or UPS, FedEx says. Hey, something's odd happening here, and they draw your attention to it.
Yeah, and then what do we do? The first thing we're doing is who shipped the package, and so we start identifying, like all these packages all across the U.S. They're all from people over the age of 70.
Oh wow, yeah,
and and so as an agent and someone who works a significant amount of financial crimes, myself and my partner were able to identify, okay, yeah, this is what this is. This is there's some type of scam going on. And by the time that we started piecing it together, a lot of the financial transactions that have already happened, because a lot of these victims were shipping cash, they were sending money, they were wiring, they were doing whatever. And the victim didn't feel like they were even being scammed. Like when we would interview them, they were in disbelief, and they trusted the scammers more than they trusted the FBI. And they felt like they were helping somebody that they trusted. And they really it was miraculous to me how aligned they were with these people, and almost to the point where it was like they were acting like they were blood, relatives. Oh, yeah. And that's the shift that we're seeing today. Fraud is no longer transactional; it's relational.
Yeah. I've heard stories of people like that, of family members, not in my family, but others who've told me about their family members who regularly sending money to these destinations. I think you and I have talked about it as well. Curiously, and this is not something we've talked about, you talk about Jamaican nights. There was an outfit out of Jamaica. They were targeting the elderly in the U.S. Do you know if they also target the elderly in, let's say, anywhere else in the world? Do they go after the British? Do they go after South American countries? Anybody that'll take their call? Anybody that'll answer the mail?
Well, they have absolutely. Well, they have a lot of call lists they get from, whether it's the dark web or they actually get them from other, call bases, call stations that they subscribe to. Some of those operate out of India notoriously. Others operate out of other countries. And on the call lists that I've seen, because I also worked a big telemarketing fraud case that was the money launderer was actually originally in Pensacola, then he moved to Foley, and it was connected to 26 different call centers in India that we wound up shutting down. As a matter of fact, for anyone who's listening that remembers those annoying, you need to renew your vehicle registration calls. Yeah, did you notice you stopped getting them around about 3 or 4 years? It was probably by now about 5 or 6 years ago. Yeah. You're welcome. And so
that's amazing. You're a celebrity.
Yeah, I'm a legend in my own mind.
Yeah,
and so. That call list that they used were purchased from other call stations. And a lot of times it came down to, marketing companies that were selling that data and then just, and other access to marketing type materials that was available online to anyone. Mm-hmm. And especially those that were willing to pay for it through a subscription. And so when we worked that big telemarketing case, as also as when we worked the Operation Jamaican Nights, I know we identified a few that were Canadian numbers, I believe a few Brits. But when I worked that big telemarketing case, that case had a significant number of Canadians and Brits.
Oh, really?
And the telemarketing scheme behind that idea, instead of Publishers Clearinghouse, was selling fake Microsoft security products.
Oh, really?
And then we even had the cooperation of Microsoft Corporation, which was really a great company to work for because they're fortunate enough on the West Coast to have an FBI agent that's specifically assigned to Microsoft to work only those types of violations. And with his assistance, we were able to get an enormous amount of cooperation from the private sector.
Sure. Yeah. I bet that's great. Well, let's go back to the private sector. What is, what is the typical 1 year from now, after your new business is up and it's got a little bit of maturity in it, what do you hope to be doing? What type of issues are you solving or preventing, I guess is the best way to put it?
Well, we talk about the private sector, and one of the things that, if anything, that certainly I look forward to in hopefully working with some of these businesses is also, being the person. I mean, just listening to me, right? I mean, my experience just with liaisoning with other law enforcement, God forbid, if any businesses are listening out there and it's like, well, it's too late. I've already been scammed, or I'm already dealing with the Bureau, but I wish I knew what was going on, but I don't. Well, for those that are listening, I mean, that's when you can also, hire somebody like me that could really assist with that. But, where I believe that I also add value is that this is where it connects directly to business owners listening to right now, the same way that I track patterns in criminal behavior and we do in the FBI, that I can now identify patterns inside your own organization. Whether it's internal fraud, whether it's process breakdowns, whether it's vendor manipulation, those things don't appear overnight. They leave signals, and most companies just don't know what they're looking for. But I do.
So they don't know what they're looking for until it's too late. Here's a wild guess. I'm going to ask you to make a wild guess. How many people listening right now, businesses, are likely being scammed? There's fraud being committed at their business or on their business and has been doing so for a while. They just have no clue. I mean, how long do these fraud cases have you found an instance where the fraud went on for years before the business owners had any idea what was going on?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I would think, looking back, I think most of the significant fraud cases that I worked did involve a lot of years.
Ongoing stuff.
And I think, quite frankly, I believe it's, not only patience on the part of the subject, the individual perpetrating the crimes, but also on the organizations targeting that business as well. I mean, if you're just going to bleed out of business, right off within the first 30 days of millions of dollars, somebody's going to notice that. But if you're going to bleed out of business through a series of, mismanagement and vulnerabilities that you identify as a corrupt employee, and that's typically the cases I worked when it came to embezzlement and those types of internal fraud cases, that took years and years and years and years. But man, when you go back and look at the audit trail and you look at whether it's merchandise, whether it's money, whether it's a combination of, that plus hours, plus travel expenses and billing and everything else. And when you look at the overall scheme, it's akin to a public corruption organization, which Cam, I've worked several of in this area, in Mobile, and quite famously in the Pritchard area. But during my time as an agent, it kind of is reminiscent of all that. The bottom line is that the same way that I approached crimes as an agent, I'm going to be doing the same thing as a consultant. I approach them like an investigator. I'm trained to find what's hidden, connect what doesn't look connected, and ask the questions that most people don't think to ask. And in today's environment, that's where the real risk is. We have a slogan I've developed. You said it was a catchy slogan. And it's Special Agent Advisory Group. We don't consult, we investigate. And that's precisely what we do.
Yeah. I think that's interesting because my impression of these financial crimes is that it's a big hit. It's a big pop. We popped them for $500,000, the criminals may say. But from what you're telling me, may not be a single pop for $500,000. It may be $10,000 a month for a big company over years, that in a big company with a lot of money moving around, they just don't notice it until time has gone through. So there are people listening going, I don't think I've been hit, but I could be.
And one of the things I'll throw out there is that a lot of times it's not money. And most of the cases I worked when there were high-level embezzlement cases involved merchandise, involved an employee that had access to certain things. In one case, it was access to computer equipment. And so, the billing of computer equipment looked seemingly legitimate. But then in the grand scheme of things, there was equipment that was legitimate and there was other equipment that was not legitimate. And then that equipment that was not legitimate was being resold on the resale market for, roughly about half was worth, but it was basically laundering money through merchandise, interstate transportation of stolen property is what it's called, ITSP. But it was almost like acting like a corrupt pawn shop at that point.
Yeah.
Right. And so the money is being able to be turned around and funneled back into the subject's bank account through stolen merchandise.
Tie that back into trust.
Yeah. And so one of the things that is the biggest issue is that people are manipulated by trust. And it doesn't matter how sophisticated a crime is or how easy a crime is. It all comes down to the same thing, and that is the manipulation of that trust. So getting somebody to do what you want them to do, one, without them realizing it, and then in the grand scheme of things, if they had known, they would have never done so. But they do it because they trust implicitly. And that doesn't mean that they're trusting blindly and they just are naive. That is someone who's skilled at what they do and is able to manipulate the trust to the point where you don't even know it's happening to you.
So there are branch managers, there are company CEOs, there are people who manage lots of people who, if I were to sit with them, they'd say, man, I've got a great team, trust every one of them, would let them care for my mother and my father and my babies. Is that a bad thing?
I mean, I don't really think it's that obvious. I think it's more about, organizations focus on revenue, on growth, and on optics. Okay. In the grand scheme of things, what I learned in business school was that is the main things organizations focus on.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a very, very broad statement. And I did that on purpose because it encompasses a lot of things. It encompasses human resources and, other types of resources like physical resources, money, employment, everything else. But most companies ignore vulnerabilities, process breakdowns, and human behavior risks. Okay. And so problems don't usually come from what a company sees, or or something as simple as like what you said, like if somebody could be manipulated into trusting because of, oh yeah, I have a relative that you want to help out. I mean, that's the classic version of the manipulative scam, like a romance scam or an employment scam or some type of scam where you're dealing one-on-one. But inside of organizations, they come from what is assumed is fine, but it really isn't.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would say is that where the trust comes in is that you put a person in a position of trust to be like, let's say, the chief information officer of a company. I mean, that's a huge hit. So let's even go lower than that. Like maybe, the person who's in charge of all the computer systems.
Yeah.
And if he identifies, wow, like they are not tracking at all, one, remote access into everyone's systems, and two, how they protect all their, in employment's personnel data, or, like PII information, and so if that's the case, then someone can manipulate that position of trust and exploit the company without its knowing. One of the things that we do as agents, or did when I was in the FBI, is we follow the money, we verify everything, and we trust the behavior over the words. And so that applies directly to businesses, if you think about it, based on what I just said. So in the Bureau, we didn't just take things at face value, and neither should any businesses that are listening right now.
Talk to me about, this is what we talked about over lunch, and I think this is wonderful. I love the title, The Pepper Spray Bandit.
Yeah.
The Pepper Spray Bandit sounds like it should be some sort of sketch on a television show.
Right. So, I love talking about stories like this because, we always talk about boring financial crime stories. And then for a certain period of my life when I was in the FBI, I worked violent crimes, and I was in charge of bank robberies out of Corpus Christi, Texas. And we had a subject that we nicknamed, my partner and I, who was also named Dan, we nicknamed him the Pepper Spray Bandit. And that's because he, there's different types of bank robberies. He did mostly note jobs, which were you just pass a note to the teller and you say, hey, this is a bank robbery, don't do anything. Or, you could say I have a weapon, but you don't really present the weapon. And you say you just put all the money in the drawer, whatever. Everything's on the note. And the tellers are trained to not argue, not to fight. The money's insured by the federal government, of course. And then everything's on video. And then, of course, they have in the trays of what they use, they have what's called, everybody knows this, it's on the internet, bait bills. And it's just a random system that the banks use. There's really no way to determine whether you're getting a bait bill or not, because there's only one way to tell, and you're not going to have access to the information. And so that those serial numbers on those dollar bills are accounted for, and they're in each drawer. And so if there's any bank robbers listening out there, and if there's no way to really beat the system as far as bait bills. It's not like, oh, I'm gonna look for this type of pack of 20s or whatever. It's not like they have some way to identify it. It's just a completely random tracking method that's used. And it's probably one of the most effective ways to track the money, because the Secret Service has the ability to then, through the financial system, track those dollar bills. So we knew that the Pepper Spray Bandit, he had robbed, I believe it was 7 banks in total by the time we were done. So he kept hitting these banks. And by the time we would get on scene, or Corpus Christi PD would get on scene, he would be gone. There was a few times where there was a bike involved, and the bike had a SKU number that matched the pawn shop, and pawn shops have the best video on the planet. I mean, I think I think in the future they're going to go back and think that the pawn shops were the ones that actually invented high res video or something like that, because their video is better than anything I've ever seen. And so, but he knew where the cameras were. He was just lucky. We just never really got a good picture of him. We never got a good view of the car. And we had a particular type of car, and we couldn't really identify it. And then then it turned out that wasn't even his car. And so we kept striking out with the Pepper Spray Bandit. But the pepper spray itself was a unique can.
He would threaten the bank teller with the pepper spray. Yeah,
he would present it several times, and he did, but he never sprayed it.
Yeah.
He just always would present it. And so on the video, you would see it, and it looked like white, and it was long. And so I remember Dan and I went to like every sporting goods store, hunting store, every place, and we could never identify this pepper spray. And so we had this tradition of every week going out to lunch. And so we would always go with the postal inspector. His name was Henry. And so we would go have lunch with Henry, and we just, talk. Henry and I were both from Philadelphia, and we were both Eagles fans. And so, it was just a friendly lunch, and we cooperated with the postal inspector as well, but we were all friends. And so I remember Henry asking right around the time we were working the cases, he was like, tell me about where you're working. And we start telling him his case. And then we're like, complaining about how we couldn't figure out this can of pepper spray and where it was. And we describe it to him, and he just looks at me and he goes, do you have a picture of this pepper spray? And I said, well, yeah, let me go get it. And, back then we didn't have them on our phones.
Right.
I had a portfolio with, I know it sounds crazy, but printed pictures, like you show an actual photo.
Old-timey
right?
stuff.
And so I show the photo to Henry. We're at Dairy Queen of all places, like the worst place to eat lunch, but hopefully Dairy Queen doesn't take offense to that.
Yeah.
But Henry goes, hey, that's a Lighthouse of the Blind product. And I knew as a former military officer what that meant immediately. And he took the words right out of my mouth. And he starts to say, yeah, that's issued to our postal carriers in the event that, they hit any vermin or dogs.
Right.
And one of the hits on the vehicles that we identified came back to a female who worked at the Postal Service.
Yeah.
And we just discounted it because it was a female, she wasn't married, and all this other stuff. So Dan and I look at each other at Dairy Queen, and our mouths are on the floor because the case was just cracked open by Henry. And who just happens to be eavesdropping on our story, per se.
Right.
And we just both look at each other and we say at the same time, it's the boyfriend.
Yeah.
And so we set up surveillance on the house, and we're just watching the place for a long time. And wouldn't you know it, I think it was a weekend, we had different shifts. We had surveillance teams, and, it was a small office, and we even had the PD, the police department augmenting our shifts. And so we're watching the girlfriend's place for a long time, and the guy never shows up. And so wouldn't you know it, I think it was like a Saturday or Sunday when everybody's like off, and I'm like, all right, I'm the case agent, I'll go sit down in the house. And he walks right out of his house. And then I'm scrambling to find people, and he just keeps on walking. I didn't know where I thought the guy was Forrest Gump for a second. I mean, he just kept walking and walking and walking. He wouldn't stop. And so finally I realized that he's walking down to the main road, and he's going into an AutoZone. And so I don't have any backup at the time. And I call, and I get approval from the lieutenant from the PD to have 2 marked units meet me there. And so we start suiting up and going into the AutoZone. And this is where I told you that how it's always like about human behavior, right?
Yeah.
And how like you'd have body language, and how like when a kid gets caught stealing a cookie out of the cookie jar, the first thing he does is he kind of freezes his hand in the cookie jar, turns around, looks at you, and he goes, I didn't do anything.
Yeah.
But his hand's still inside the cookie jar, and he's looking right at you as he's telling you that, but almost like if I stay still, they won't see my hand in the cookie jar. So, we're all like vested up and everything, and it was me and 2 police officers, and we walk in, and one of them even had a long gun. And we walk into AutoZone. Everybody in that store turned around and looked at us like the war had just come to AutoZone.
Yeah.
Right? What do you think the subject did?
Wouldn't make eye contact. Looked away.
Exactly. He turned right back around. He looked, saw us, and then turned right back around and faced the cash register. Meanwhile, everyone, including the cash register, they're all looking our way.
Yeah.
And he just was pegged at looking at the cash register, and like almost like he's saying to himself, if I stay still, if I keep looking this way, maybe they won't see me.
If I don't make eye contact, they won't figure out it's me.
Right. So we had a search warrant for his house. We wound up taking him back. There's some other funny stories in there you've talked about we won't bore your listeners with. But so we're going through his house, and I remember there was an attic cutout in the ceiling. And, when you go through a house initially, you ask to take entry photos. And so I asked one of the ERT, the evidence response technicians, to take a photo of the ceiling. And I got a stool, and I reach up there, and I pulled down a shopping bag full of cash.
Yeah.
And I said, all right, we're done here, And I proceeded to pull down several bags of cash up there. He stashed the entire amount up there. And then when we wound up counting the money in his kitchen table, in his kitchen inside the house, normally with the bait bills, that's why I brought that up earlier. Normally you'd find like, you're lucky to get 10% of the bait bills. I mean, because, the money's passed through the financial system. It's hard, you're passing cash. This guy had not only bait bills from every single bank that he robbed that gave him bait bills, which I believe was at the time 5 out of 7.
Yeah.
He had like almost all of the bait bills.
Yeah.
He was literally the most unlucky pepper spray bandit I've ever worked. So anyway, that's the pepper spray bandit
I love
story.
that story. I love that at Dairy Queen, having lunch with your buddy, the case gets broken.
Right.
And you're like, oh my gosh, it landed in your lap. After so much work, it landed in your lap. So tell me what the next, I want to ask you about Mr. Mueller. Mueller is the way it was pronounced.
Director Mueller,
Mueller.
Yes.
In a moment, but tell me what's next on your private sector business, and then I want to hear your comments on him since he passed away so recently.
Well, what's next is it's I just retired a few months ago. Cam, you can give me a break here.
Yeah, exactly. Come on, man.
Jeez,
I want to see some production.
Right. Look, I think that one of the things that I look forward to hopefully doing in the private sector is, just the way fraud leaves fingerprints long before it leaves damage, right? I want that, in the same feeling we talked about, is nothing better than having that feeling of recovering money for that victim.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like a sense of purpose, right?
Yeah.
Tony Robbins talks about that, a sense of purpose. And I think that, one of the things that will give me purpose in my post-retirement career is that same type of feeling. And, helping businesses not only prevent that, but also solve it, and even in many cases recover it, is a huge win, and it's a great feeling. So I really, I didn't really leave the FBI to slow down. I left it to bring that mindset into places that need it but don't have it.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. Director Mueller was the leader of the FBI when you were there for a great part of your career. He passed away not long ago. Had some sort of controversy around him towards the end of his career, but I'm curious of your thoughts. You told me you had met him once before. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, I'm not going to get into the political commentary.
Right.
But I will say this, that Director Mueller dedicated his life to public service, the Marine Corps, the Department of Justice, and leading the FBI during some of the most critical periods in this country.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking about 9/11. Talking about the rechanging of the entire FBI architecture into really what it is today. And in our world, we judge people by how they serve and how they lead. And he carried himself with discipline, professionalism, and integrity.
Yeah.
And when someone like that passes, I think it's appropriate to recognize that service and that contribution, regardless of anyone's personal views.
Yeah.
And as you said, I had a personal interaction with him that really stuck with me. And what stood out wasn't his position, it was his presence. He was professional, grounded, and respectful, and that left a leadership impression on me.
Yeah.
I was at an airport. It was when he was working for the NFL at the time. And I was just wrapping up my tour at FBI headquarters. As a matter of fact, I was in the process of moving to the Mobile office to where we are today doing this recording. And I remember, as FBI agents, we fly armed. It's almost akin to like being an air marshal, except you're not an air marshal. And a lot of times there are no air marshals on board, and you're also the only federal or even local or state law enforcement officer on the airplane. And you have this flying arms certification. It's like a certificate. Some airports use sheets, others use like tickets, but basically you're identified as the LEO, they call it, the law enforcement officer on board. And so you're required to pre-check in with the crew. You're also required to check in with the captain and pre-board the aircraft ahead of time, and to make sure that the safety is there's a little safety brief, and the safety is paramount on the aircraft, because if something happens on an aircraft, even though you may be on leave or you may be working, counterintelligence and you're not working airplane crimes, it doesn't matter. You're that
You're
officer.
the guy.
You're
the first
if something
man up.
happens on an aircraft, you're going to be you're going in for a long night.
Yeah.
And so I checked in with the crew, as I always did. And as I was checking in, I'll never forget this. The gate agent says to me, he says, "Hey, did you see your former boss is sitting over there?" And as I'm looking, I see Director Mueller sitting in the gate agent area, and he makes a joke. The gate agent says, yeah, you have better status than he has. You're ahead of him on the first class list. You're number one. And I said, well, okay, well, what's he? And he said, well, he's number two. And I said, okay, well, you need to give him that ticket. And the gate agent says to me, he says, well, no, I can't do that. I've already swapped it in the system, and you're flying armed. I'd have to tell the captain. And I said, well, tell the captain. And he's like, well, I don't think I can do that. And I said, well, then I'll give him my ticket. But that's his ticket. And then he kind of argued with me a little about it. It wasn't like a, terse argument or anything, but, and I just basically told him, I said, look, if you think that I'm going to get on this aircraft and fly in first class while the former director of the FBI is sitting in coach, I was like, you've got another thing coming. That's just not going to happen.
Right.
So you either give him the ticket or I'll give him the ticket. And he's like, no, that won't be necessary. So he did some, I don't even know if he really went back and talked to the captain or whatever, but he was gone a little bit, and he comes back. He's like, all right, I've reissued the tickets. Do you want me to tell him anything? I said, no, absolutely not. I said, I'm just going to go over and say hi, and that's it. And so I went over and introduced myself to the director, and I had not seen him since graduation. And he was very, very nice. You could tell he really, really loved that an FBI agent came up and said hi to him.
Yeah.
Especially because I think he was in the middle of some of that controversy you spoke of. And then I said to him, I said, director, and he said, please call me Bob. And I said, all right, sir.
Yeah.
I said, I don't know if you remember me. There's no way you remember this, but I made you laugh at graduation because you had found out I went to the Air Force Academy, and you made a joke about it, how you were going to send me. And he looks at me as I'm telling the story, and he goes, as I'm telling the story, he says, I do remember this.
Yeah.
He's like, I told you, and then he interrupted me. He's like, I told you I was going to send you to the Middle East. I said, well, actually, you said Djibouti, which is in Africa. But yeah, close enough. And you said it was because I went to the Air Force Academy. And then I said, sir, that's fine. And then that's when he smiled as I was saying it, because he was recalling this. Yep. And I said, sir, that's fine, because at the Air Force Academy, we're at 7,250 feet above altitude, far, far above that of Annapolis and West Point.
Right.
And of course, everybody knows Bob Mueller was an Annapolis grad. He was just a true warrior. And so he laughed and he remembered me. And then and this is what a man, he was just a stand-up guy. I mean, he actually remembered at the time, my wife, the mother of my children, my ex-wife now. But he remembered her. He remembered Sonia. And he asked how she was doing. He asked if we had kids yet.
Yeah.
He was asking about my kids. I told him about my boys. I told him that's why because I had taken a transfer. Sonia and I had gotten divorced, and I took a transfer to the Mobile office, and he was so curious about that, because that's called a hardship transfer in the Bureau. And so I was in the middle of a hardship transfer, and that's why I was moving to the Mobile office. It's the only reason why I left headquarters, because I'm on track to become a supervisor and maybe someday be an SAC. But he was so inquisitive about that, and then he told me how proud he was of me for choosing fatherhood over leadership in the FBI, and how he was just an absolute gracious man. I never told him that I gave him my ticket, and so of course I pre-board, and he knew the deal. He knows I'm an FBI agent, so they said something like pre-boarding now, and any special people or whatever, and that's kind of our cue to get on. And so I went and got on the aircraft, and then when they had the passengers board, of course, he's first class, and he winds up boarding, and he comes back to my seat. I think I was in like row 7 or something. And he comes back and he says, Dan, you didn't have to do that. Dan, just go up there and sit in your seat. They told me you gave me, you don't have to do that. I said, sir, that's your seat. And I didn't get up. I was very respectful. And then he said, no, Dan, please. And I said, sir, that is your seat. Please.
Yeah.
Go sit down and enjoy the flight. And he knew what was happening. He knew there was no sense in arguing with me. And he just smiled and he said, well, thank you very much. And I said, yes, sir. I said, rank has its privileges. And he laughed, because that was a saying we said in the military. So it was just a really nice interaction with him. And by the time I got to my new office, our former SAC here, Rob Lasky, had brought me into his office. I had just gotten there. And it was funny, you think you're in trouble or something, right? Because you're brought to the office, you're like, whoa, what's going on?
Right.
And the first thing he asked me, he's like, hey, do you know the former director of the FBI? And I just went, before I can answer, he's like, well, he wrote you we have this card for you, and it's a personal note. We had to open it because we thought it was a scam or something. And apparently, he's your friend or something? Like, what is this all about? And so he wrote me this kind card on his stationery. He signed it Bob Triple I. We called him Bobby Triple Sticks in the bureau. And it was just a nice little thank you note to me that he sent to my field office, knowing that I was coming to Mobile.
Yeah.
And, I'll never forget that. And I still have that card.
Yeah.
One of these days, it's in storage because I'm in the process of moving. But I'll hopefully get it out of storage and take a picture of it and post it in his memory, because he was just a wonderful man.
Yeah, it's a good story. It is a good story, and your treatment of him is a good story. His treatment of you is a good story. Good story all the way around. So we're coming to a close here. Going to wrap it up. What do people need to know? Tell. There's somebody out here listening to this. Perhaps they're running a business and think, something just feels off, or I'd love somebody to come check the plumbing, if you will, make sure everything's running right. How do they find you? What's their next step to reach out and learn more of what you can do for them?
Well, the way people can reach me, obviously, I'm on LinkedIn. You can email me at specialagentadvisorygroup@proton.me. You can also email me directly on my personal email that's on my LinkedIn page or through my LinkedIn page. And that's one of the easier ways to reach me. We'll also have links on your website to reach me. But, at the end of the day, for those that are listening, or like really, like you said, are they unsure? Like, they really want to involve, someone of my skills? It's most problems don't start where people think they do. You just need someone who knows where to look. And, I'm able to break down real world fraud, scams, and business risks and see what other people aren't seeing. And like we say, and we've coined the phrase, we don't consult, we investigate.
Yeah, I think that's strong. Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. And I'd like to kind of keep the door open. I'd love to have you come back and report in on new things that you see going on out there, new crimes, new ways of going about fraud, whatever it may be. As these trends change, these criminals tend to be very crafty. And as you notice the changes and as you notice the new technologies, whatever it may be, get you back in that seat up there and update our listeners on, say, hey, this is what's new out there, folks. Put your radar up.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I would really enjoy talking with you next time when we have more time is about cybercrime.
Yeah.
Cybercrime today is really just a delivery system. I mean, what people don't realize that the objective is almost always the same. It's money, access, and control. And that it's not really a tech problem. It's just financial crime problem wearing a hoodie.
Yeah, I love that. So define cybercrime. Let's whet the appetite. Define cybercrime differently from the financial crimes that we've been talking about.
Well, you can't really define it differently because it's one and the same. It's, like I said, it's financial crime wearing a hoodie. Everything now is cyber-based. And so if people think that cybercrime, that's just cryptocurrency fraud. And granted, cryptocurrency fraud is a complex method of investigation because you have, you have the chain analysis, you have different types of, cryptocurrency tokens involved and everything. And it's just a very, very complex scheme. But once you identify the mechanisms, it's all the same. And then even cryptocurrency is still a financial transaction, right? It's just extremely technical. But everything we do is technical. I mean, even like just regular old-fashioned snatch and grab crimes are technical because someone's going to have a cell phone. Yeah. Someone's going to have video. Someone's going to have an audio recording. We live in a tech age. We are no longer into just like a non-technical arena.
Yeah.
Everything is technical. And even when you do search warrants these days, you have to have a computer response team. I mean, I remember, I'm old enough to remember where it was kind of optional. Hey, we're going to bring the CART guys out on a search warrant.
Yeah.
And now it's pretty much mandatory because they're going to have a smartphone. They're going to have a hard drive. They're going to have some type of evidence. They're going to have camera systems. They're going to have something, right? That's going to be traceable to some type of technical cyber type, criminal evidence.
Yeah.
And organizations operate on the same features. And so everything is operating in the same realm. And basically, like I said before, I don't approach problems like a consultant. I don't break them up into different arenas, whether it's cybercrime or technical crime or cryptocurrency fraud. I approach it like an investigator. I'm trained to find what's hidden, connect what doesn't look connected, and ask the questions that most people don't even think to ask.
All right. Well, you queued us up for our next episode, looking further into cybercrime. I sure appreciate it, Dan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cam.
We will have his contact info in the show notes. If this is something, his services are something you think you need or you would like to send to your peers or colleagues to say, hey, I heard this guy and you need to check him out, please do so. You'll find those in the show notes. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. We'll have another show before too long. Have a good week, everybody.